Karen Jenkins was not your typical tourist. She had always been the kind of person who liked things done her way, and she didn't shy away from voicing her opinions, no matter how loud or disruptive they might seem to others. Her friends back home often joked that Karen could turn a trip to the grocery store into a dramatic event. But this time, it wasn't just a joke. It was about to become international news. It all started on a sunny morning in London. Karen had planned her vacation meticulously, marking every iconic landmark on her map. Buckingham Palace was at the top of her list. She imagined herself standing there, camera in hand, capturing the perfect photo with the famous royal guards as her backdrop. But what Karen hadn't accounted for was the sheer number of people gathered around her. Families with children, couples holding hands, and groups of friends filled the area, all eager to witness the changing of the guard ceremony, a tradition steeped in history and pride. As the crowd swelled, Karen found herself pushed further away from the front row. Frustration bubbled inside her. "Excuse me." She snapped at a tall man blocking her view. He glanced over his shoulder but didn't budge. Karen tried again, louder this time. "Can you move? Some of us actually want to see something." But instead of clearing a path, the man simply shrugged and turned back toward the guards. Her irritation grew. To Karen, these tourists were being selfish, hogging space without considering others. She muttered under her breath, complaining about how ridiculous the whole thing was. "It's just a bunch of guys in funny hats," she grumbled, earning disapproving looks from those within earshot. No one said anything directly to her, though. They were too focused on the spectacle unfolding before them. The rhythmic marching, the brass bands playing patriotic tunes, and the immaculate uniforms of the soldiers standing tall like statues. But Karen couldn't appreciate any of it. All she saw was an obstacle between her and her Instagram-worthy photo. Her eyes darted around, searching for a solution. That's when she spotted the small can of bright blue spray paint peeking out of her tote bag. She bought it days earlier as a gag gift for her kids, thinking it would make them laugh. Now, staring at it, an idea began forming in her mind. An idea born out of anger and impulsiveness. At first, she hesitated. The rational part of her brain screamed that this was a terrible idea, but the louder, angrier voice drowned it out. "They're ruining my vacation," she thought bitterly. "Why shouldn't I ruin theirs?" And so, with a mix of defiance and recklessness, Karen made her move. What happened next would change her life forever, and not in the way she expected. The tension built as Karen stepped forward, clutching the can tightly in her hand. People nearby noticed her sudden shift in demeanor but assumed she was just another impatient tourist trying to squeeze through the crowd. Little did they know, Karen was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Karen's heart raced as she moved closer to the line of royal guards, her fingers gripping the cold metal can of spray paint. The world around her seemed to blur. The chatter of excited tourists, the blaring trumpets, and the rhythmic clinking of boots against the pavement faded into the background. All she could focus on was her growing frustration and the absurdity of the situation in her mind. She convinced herself that this act would somehow even the score, as if defacing a centuries-old tradition would magically solve her trivial problem of not getting a good view. As she reached the edge of the crowd, Karen locked eyes with one of the guards, a young man standing perfectly still, his expression blank but commanding. His uniform was immaculate. Red coat, shiny black boots, and a tall bearskin hat that added to his imposing presence. To Karen, he wasn't just a symbol of British history. He represented everything she felt was wrong with the scene in front of her. In her clouded judgment, she saw him as part of the system keeping her from what she wanted. Without thinking twice, Karen raised the can and pressed down on the nozzle. A streak of neon blue shot through the air, splattering across the guard's chest. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The vibrant color contrasted sharply against the deep red fabric of his uniform, drawing gasps and shrieks from the crowd. Phones were whipped out instantly, capturing every detail of the shocking scene unfolding before them. Tourists who had been peacefully enjoying the ceremony now turned their attention to Karen, their faces a mix of disbelief and outrage. The guard didn't flinch. Trained to remain stoic under any circumstances, he stood rooted in place, refusing to acknowledge the chaos erupting around him. But the same couldn't be said for the security personnel stationed nearby. Within seconds, two burly officers sprinted toward Karen, shouting orders for her to drop the can. Panic set in as she realized the gravity of what she'd done. Her initial bravado melted away, replaced by wide-eyed fear as the officers grabbed her arms and yanked her backward. "Let me go," Karen protested weakly, struggling against their grip. It was just a joke. But no one was laughing. The crowd parted to let the officers drag her away, some shaking their heads in disgust, while others recorded videos to share online. Whispers spread like wildfire. Who does she think she is? How dare she disrespect something so important? Even children tugged at their parents' sleeves, pointing at Karen as she was hauled off, her face flushed with embarrassment. Once outside the palace gates, Karen was shoved into a waiting police van. As the doors slammed shut behind her, she caught a glimpse of herself in the rearview mirror. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, and her hands trembled uncontrollably. It was then that reality began to sink in. This wasn't just a harmless prank gone wrong. It was a public spectacle, one that would soon spiral far beyond anything she could have imagined. Little did Karen know, the consequences of her actions were only beginning, and they would haunt her for years to come. Within hours, Karen's face was plastered across social media platforms worldwide. The video of her spraying paint on the royal guard had gone viral, shared millions of times by people eager to express their shock and outrage. The clip played on endless loops on news channels, accompanied by dramatic headlines like "Tourists' Shocking Attack on Royal Guard" and entitled "Tourist Destroys Sacred Tradition." Comment sections exploded with opinions, memes mocking Karen began circulating, and hashtags like #Paintgate and #KarenGate trended globally. At first, many viewers thought it was a staged prank or some kind of performance art. But as more context emerged, the truth became undeniable. This was no joke. Social media users dissected every detail of the incident. The look of disbelief on bystanders' faces, the bright blue streak marring the guard's pristine uniform, and Karen's own panicked reaction when security intervened. People couldn't get enough of it, analyzing every second of the footage as if it were a scene from a movie. The backlash was swift and merciless. Online commentators labeled Karen's actions not only disrespectful, but also racially motivated. Some pointed out that the royal guards are symbols of British heritage and pride, representing centuries of tradition and service. Others argued that her behavior reflected deeper prejudices, suggesting she felt entitled to disrupt something sacred simply because she didn't value its significance. Memes mocked her appearance, turning her into an internet villain overnight. One particularly popular meme showed Karen holding the spray can with the caption, "When privilege meets poor decisions." Journalists quickly dug into Karen's past, uncovering previous incidents where she had displayed similar behavior. A local newspaper published an article detailing how she once berated a cashier for refusing to accept expired coupons. Another report highlighted a heated argument she'd had with a neighbor over parking space. These stories painted a picture of someone who struggled to control her temper and often placed herself above rules or social norms. Her name became synonymous with entitlement and arrogance, making her a target for ridicule. Meanwhile, the royal family released a brief statement condemning the act, calling it an unacceptable breach of respect for our nation's traditions. Public figures weighed in too, with celebrities and politicians alike expressing their disappointment. Some even called for stricter penalties for tourists who disrespected cultural landmarks. The narrative around Karen shifted from mere annoyance to outright condemnation, with many demanding justice for what they saw as an attack on British identity. As the days passed, Karen's story continued to dominate conversations both online and offline. Late-night talk show hosts joked about her antics, while morning news programs debated whether her actions warranted legal consequences. Even late-night cab drivers and office workers discussed her over coffee, shaking their heads at her audacity. For Karen, there was no escaping the spotlight. Her face was everywhere, her name forever linked to one reckless decision. What started as a fleeting moment of frustration had spiraled into a global scandal, leaving her reputation in tatters and her future uncertain. Years passed, and Karen's name faded from the headlines, replaced by newer scandals and fleeting viral moments. Yet, her story lingered in collective memory, often resurfacing as a cautionary tale about privilege, impulsivity, and the consequences of unchecked anger. Documentaries explored her downfall, dissecting how one reckless act could unravel a life so completely. Journalists revisited the incident during discussions about cultural sensitivity, using her actions as an example of what not to do when visiting another country or engaging with traditions different from your own. For Karen, this legacy of shame was impossible to escape. Even in her quiet new life, she occasionally encountered reminders of her past. A stranger might recognize her at the grocery store and whisper to their companion, or an old clip of her arrest would pop up on social media timelines. Each time, it felt like reopening a wound that had barely begun to heal. She tried not to let these moments define her, focusing instead on the small victories she achieved daily, like mentoring a struggling student or earning a smile from someone who initially doubted her sincerity. Still, the weight of guilt remained, a constant shadow over her existence. Her attempts at redemption earned mixed reactions. Some people admired her willingness to confront her mistakes and work toward change, seeing her story as proof that everyone deserves a second chance. Others remained skeptical, convinced that her efforts were too little, too late. Online debates raged whenever her name came up, with some arguing that she had paid her dues, while others insisted she should never be forgiven for tarnishing something so sacred. These polarized opinions mirrored society's ongoing struggle to balance accountability with compassion. Karen herself found solace in routine and reflection. She spent her evenings journaling, pouring her thoughts onto paper as a way to process her emotions and track her growth. In those pages, she admitted things she couldn't say aloud, that she still wrestled with regret every single day, that she sometimes wondered if she'd ever truly make amends, and that she feared being remembered only for her worst moment. Writing became her therapy, a private space where she could confront her inner turmoil without judgment. Occasionally, she allowed herself to dream of a future where her past wouldn't overshadow everything else. What would it feel like to walk into a room without carrying the baggage of Paintgate? To introduce herself without worrying if someone might Google her name later? These fantasies weren't selfish. They were tiny glimpses of hope, reminders that even amidst ruin, there is always room for reinvention. But for now, Karen accepted her reality. She continued volunteering, working odd jobs, and quietly striving to be better than she had been before. Her relationships with her children improved slightly. They began inviting her to family gatherings, though conversations remained guarded. Tom remained distant, but Karen didn't push for more. She understood that forgiveness wasn't guaranteed. It had to be earned, and she was willing to wait however long it took. In the end, Karen's story served as both a warning and a lesson. It reminded people of the fragility of reputation and the importance of respecting boundaries, whether cultural, personal, or societal. For Karen, it was a lifelong journey of learning, humility, and resilience. Though the world may never fully forgive her, she chose to focus on the one thing she could control, becoming someone worthy of her own forgiveness. And perhaps in time, that would be enough. Karen's arrest marked the beginning of a legal nightmare that would consume her life. The charges against her were severe: criminal damage, public disorder, and assault on a member of the armed forces. These weren't minor infractions. They carried significant penalties, including potential jail time. As she sat in a holding cell, still wearing the same clothes from the day of the incident, Karen struggled to process the magnitude of what was happening. Her mind raced with questions. How had things escalated so quickly? Would anyone believe her when she said it was all a stupid mistake? Her court hearing came sooner than expected, drawing massive crowds outside the courthouse. Reporters jostled for position, microphones in hand, hoping to catch a glimpse of Karen as she arrived. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Prosecutors wasted no time laying out their case, presenting evidence that painted Karen as reckless and malicious. Security footage from Buckingham Palace clearly showed her stepping forward with the spray can, aiming it at the guard, and pulling the trigger. Witness testimonies added fuel to the fire, with several bystanders describing her behavior as aggressive and deliberate. The prosecution also highlighted the significance of the royal guards, emphasizing their role as protectors of tradition and symbols of national pride. They argued that Karen's actions weren't just an isolated act of vandalism, but an insult to British culture itself. One prosecutor even suggested that her possession of the spray paint proved premeditation, implying she had planned the entire stunt before arriving at the palace. To many in the courtroom, this argument seemed convincing. After all, why else would someone carry a can of paint to such a prestigious event? Karen's lawyer tried to counter these claims, portraying her client as impulsive rather than intentionally harmful. He argued that Karen's frustration had gotten the better of her, and that she never meant to cause lasting damage or offend anyone. This was a momentary lapse in judgment, he told the judge, not a calculated attack. But his words fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. The judge listened impassively, occasionally scribbling notes, but gave little indication of sympathy. When bail was brought up, the prosecution vehemently opposed it, citing concerns about Karen fleeing the country given her dual citizenship. The judge ultimately sided with them, denying her request. For Karen, this was a crushing blow. She had hoped to return home, regroup, and prepare a proper defense. But now she faced the grim reality of remaining behind bars until her trial. As the gavel struck, sealing her fate, Karen felt a wave of despair wash over her. This wasn't how her vacation was supposed to end. Public pressure only intensified during this period. Petitions demanding harsher consequences for Karen gained thousands of signatures, while social media users continued to vilify her. Some called for deportation, arguing that foreign tourists should be held accountable for respecting the countries they visit. Others pushed for educational campaigns to prevent similar incidents in the future. Amidst all the noise, Karen's voice was drowned out, her side of the story largely ignored or dismissed as excuses. As days turned into weeks, Karen began to realize the enormity of her mistake. What had seemed like a fleeting act of rebellion now loomed over her like a dark cloud, threatening to destroy everything she held dear. Her freedom, reputation, and livelihood hung precariously in the balance, leaving her to wonder if she'd ever be able to rebuild her life after this ordeal. When Karen was finally released from prison, the world outside felt both familiar and foreign. Stepping into the crisp air of a quiet morning, she took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. Freedom tasted sweet, but it came with a heaviness she couldn't ignore. The scars of her past were still fresh, not just in her mind, but in the way people looked at her. Even though 2 years had passed since the incident, Paintgate remained etched in public memory, a cautionary tale that refused to fade. Karen knew she had to start small. She rented a modest studio apartment in a town where no one recognized her, far away from the life she once led. Her first job was stocking shelves at a local grocery store, a far cry from her days as a marketing manager. At first, coworkers eyed her warily, unsure what to make of the new hire who rarely spoke and kept to herself. But Karen worked hard, showing up early and staying late, determined to prove she wasn't the same person they'd seen on the news. Slowly, some began to warm up to her, seeing glimpses of sincerity behind her guarded demeanor. Volunteering became another crucial part of her journey. On weekends, Karen joined a community center that helped struggling families. She tutored children in reading, sorted donations, and even assisted with food drives. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. One day, while helping a young boy sound out words in a picture book, she realized how much she missed connecting with others. For the first time in a long time, She felt like she was doing something meaningful, something that might help repair the damage she caused. Despite these efforts, Karen's attempts at redemption weren't always met with open arms. She wrote heartfelt letters of apology to the royal family and the affected guard, expressing her regret and begging for forgiveness. To her disappointment, none of them responded. She also reached out to organizations promoting cultural awareness and respect, offering to speak publicly about her mistakes if it could prevent others from making similar errors. While some groups politely declined, a few agreed to let her share her story during workshops or panel discussions. These moments were difficult. Standing in front of strangers and recounting her lowest point left her vulnerable and exposed. Yet she persisted, believing it was a necessary step toward healing. Her family, however, remained distant. Tom had moved on, remarrying and starting a new chapter without her. Her children, now older, occasionally sent polite texts, but kept their conversations brief. They were cordial, but the warmth Karen craved was missing. She understood why. They had suffered because of her actions, but it didn't make the ache any less painful. Nights were often lonely, filled with thoughts of what could have been if only she had acted differently that fateful day. The media hadn't forgotten her either. Every so often, articles or documentaries revisited her story, using it as an example of unchecked privilege and poor decision-making. Some portrayed her redemption attempts as genuine, while others dismissed them as calculated moves to salvage her reputation. Either way, Karen learned to live with the constant reminders of her past. She stopped reading comments online and avoided places where cameras might appear. Instead, she focused on building a quieter, humbler life, one where she could contribute positively without seeking validation. Though progress was slow, Karen held on to hope. She knew she couldn't erase what she had done, nor did she deserve to be absolved entirely. But she believed in the possibility of change, for herself and for how others saw her. Redemption wasn't about erasing guilt. It was about learning to carry it responsibly. And so, with each passing day, Karen took small steps forward, determined to honor the lessons she had learned the hard way. Back home, the fallout from Karen's actions hit like a tidal wave, sweeping away everything she had worked for and leaving behind a trail of broken relationships and shattered dreams. News of her arrest and the global backlash reached her small town within hours, turning her into a local pariah. Neighbors who once exchanged pleasantries with her now avoided eye contact, while others whispered behind closed doors about how they always knew something was off about her. The cozy suburban life Karen had built for herself began to crumble under the weight of shame and public scrutiny. Her employer was one of the first to cut ties, a mid-level manager at a marketing firm. Karen had prided herself on her professionalism and ability to get results. But after videos of her spraying paint on the royal guard went viral, clients started pulling out of contracts, citing concerns about associating with her company. Facing mounting pressure, her boss called her into an emergency meeting via video call. "Karen," he said solemnly, "we've decided it's best if you step away from your role here. It's nothing personal, but the situation has become too damaging for the business." With that, Karen found herself unemployed, her steady income gone in an instant. The impact on her family was even more devastating. Her husband, Tom, had always been patient with Karen's fiery temper, brushing off her outbursts as quirks rather than serious issues. But this time was different. The constant media attention, the judgmental stares when he ran errands, and the late-night calls from concerned relatives wore him down. One evening, after a particularly heated argument, Tom finally broke down. "I don't know who you are anymore," he confessed, tears streaming down his face. "This isn't the woman I married." Days later, he filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. For Karen, losing Tom felt like losing her last anchor to normalcy. Her children bore the brunt of the fallout as well. Both teenagers, they were already navigating the challenges of high school, but now they faced relentless bullying from classmates. Mocking comments about their mother filled hallways and social media feeds, making it impossible for them to escape the humiliation. Their grades plummeted, and their mental health suffered. Eventually, Tom made the difficult decision to enroll them in a new school district far from their hometown, hoping to give them a fresh start. Karen barely got to say goodbye before they left, another painful reminder of how much she had lost. Isolated and vilified, Karen retreated into a deep depression. She stopped answering calls from friends, most of whom had already distanced themselves anyway. Her once busy calendar now sat empty, devoid of plans or purpose. Nights stretched endlessly as she lay awake replaying the incident over and over in her mind, wondering how she could have handled things differently. The vibrant, confident woman she used to be seemed like a distant memory, replaced by someone hollowed out by regret and self-loathing. To make matters worse, financial pressures mounted. Without a job, Karen struggled to keep up with bills, let alone hire a top-tier lawyer for her upcoming trial. She sold her car, dipped into savings, and eventually moved into a tiny apartment to cut costs. Yet no amount of downsizing could erase the emotional toll of her choices. Every knock at the door sent her heart racing, fearing it might be reporters or angry strangers looking to confront her. Even grocery shopping became a daunting task, as she constantly worried about being recognized. As weeks turned into months, Karen realized the hardest part wasn't just the loss of material comforts, it was the loneliness. Once surrounded by people who cared about her, she now found herself utterly alone, grappling with the consequences of a single reckless act. Though she tried to convince herself that things would improve, deep down, she knew the road ahead would be long and arduous. Rebuilding her life seemed like an insurmountable challenge, but for the first time, Karen began to understand the true cost of her actions and the immense effort it would take to make amends. The trial was the most nerve-wracking experience of Karen's life. Dressed in a plain gray suit, her hands trembling as she clutched a tissue, she walked into the courtroom feeling like every pair of eyes was piercing through her. Reporters lined the benches, cameras clicking incessantly, while spectators whispered among themselves about the infamous Paintgate woman. The atmosphere was heavy with judgment, and Karen couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a public reckoning. Her lawyer did his best to present her side of the story, framing her actions as impulsive rather than malicious. He called witnesses who testified to Karen's generally good character, including a former coworker who described her as hardworking and dependable. But these testimonies felt weak compared to the prosecution's case. They brought forward experts who explained the cultural and historical significance of the Royal Guards, emphasizing how Karen's act had disrespected not only the individual guard, but also centuries of tradition. One historian even likened her behavior to defacing a national monument, arguing that it went beyond mere vandalism. Karen herself took the stand, her voice wavering as she tried to explain her mindset that day. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I was frustrated and angry, and I made a terrible mistake. I never intended to disrespect anyone or their culture." She spoke about her struggles with managing stress and how she wished she could turn back time to undo what she had done. For a brief moment, there was silence in the room, as if people were considering whether her remorse was genuine. But the prosecution wasn't swayed. They argued that intent mattered less than the impact of her actions. Whether she meant to offend or not is irrelevant, the prosecutor stated firmly. The fact remains that she caused harm, disrupted a national ceremony, and damaged property belonging to the state. He reminded the jury of the viral videos, the global outrage, and the lasting stain, both literal and metaphorical, on British heritage. By the time closing arguments rolled around, it was clear that sympathy for Karen was in short supply. After hours of deliberation, the verdict came, guilty on all counts. As the judge read out her sentence, 2 years in prison, a hefty fine, and a lifetime ban from entering the UK, Karen's legs buckled beneath her. Her lawyer reached out to steady her, whispering words of reassurance, but nothing could soften the blow. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some satisfied with the outcome, others shaking their heads at the severity of the punishment. For Karen, It was the final nail in the coffin of her old life. Prison was a harsh reality check. Used to a comfortable existence, she now found herself in a cramped cell with a stranger, eating bland food and following strict routines. At first, she struggled to adapt, overwhelmed by fear and loneliness. Other inmates recognized her face from the news and taunted her, calling her royal wrecker and mocking her downfall. It was humiliating, but slowly Karen began to toughen up. She learned to keep her head down, focus on survival, and take advantage of programs offered to inmates, such as anger management classes and therapy sessions. It was during these sessions that Karen started to confront the root causes of her behavior. With the help of a compassionate counselor, she explored her tendencies toward impulsiveness and entitlement. She realized that much of her frustration stemmed from a lifetime of expecting things to go her way and lashing out when they didn't. Though painful, this self-reflection gave her a glimmer of hope. Maybe, she thought, this nightmare could lead to something positive. Maybe she could emerge from prison a better person. Still, the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Even after serving her time, Karen knew the world outside wouldn't simply forgive and forget. Her name would forever be tied to the scandal, and rebuilding trust would require years of effort. But for the first time since the incident, she allowed herself to believe that redemption might be possible if she was willing to work for it.